Welcome again to Principles of Organismal Biology. Last week, we learned a lot of things. We introduced biology and the biological processes, and we defined that a lot of the diversity is due to evolution. We also learned about one of the most important molecules on Earth, that's DNA, and we covered gene expression. And if you know where I'm going, yes, I'm going towards mutation. So we learn about mutation, and we learned that all of the sources of variation, genetic variation, are due to mutation, right? So today we are going to dive into evolution. So last week we covered the molecule involving evolution, and also some of the mechanisms, like the genetic mechanism for it. Today's lecture is about natural selection, or evolution through natural selection. And we're going to cover a lot of important things. Who was the main proponent of evolution? And that's Charles Darwin. We're going to describe the theory of evolution of natural selection. What evidence do we have for that? And also what's adaptation and what's fitness. This is a very cool class today. So we have studied the molecular mechanism by which evolution occurs, right? That's mutation. Remember, mutation is the source of all genetic variation, and that has a consequence in the phenotype most of the times. Then what's evolution? If you remember, in the first class, I told you that evolution, in the sense of Darwin, is descendant with modification. And that is, your descendant from your parents, but you are a modified version. You're not exactly the same. And so this is very important. Now, scientists and naturalists have long recognized patterns of similarity and differences among organisms. And evolution was recognized before Darwin. That means that evolution, the sense of a change, has been in the minds of naturalists. So let's look at this. Let's just go back in time around the Greeks, right? By the time of Aristotle. Back then, a proponent of the ladder of life, or the Scala Naturae, was Aristotle. And they actually were considering that God was at the top of this creation, and then the angels and archangels, and then man was somewhere in here, but not represented well in this image. It was men, and then women, and I think cows and other things in the same level as women. And then there was this ladder, right? And the sense of a progression or an improvement. So this was the idea ruling around the Greeks. And then we have the medieval ages. And as you probably know, during the medieval ages, there was not much development of science. But then around the 1790s, we started having some brilliant minds thinking about some important concepts that now we can integrate. One of them is Hutton, who proposed the principles of gradualism. That's that this is the first idea that things are changing, a species can change. And then we're gonna be exploring ideas that help Darwin to elaborate this brilliant concept of evolution by natural selection. So the other idea is Malthus' ideas, and he published an essay on the principle of population. And he proposed that a population left unchecked, it will finish all of the resources. That means all of the food available, and that will crash the population. And that was based on humans. But some people was also thinking that that could be true for other species. Then we have Lamarck right here, published his hypothesis of evolution. And so Lamarck was a French biologist, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, and he actually proposed two principles, and you probably are familiar with these principles. One is the principle of use and disuse. And this idea is that a part of the body that it's used frequently can become modified as a result of this use. Like if it's being used to reach something, that part might become larger and stronger, while those that are not used, they get lost, they deteriorate. So that's the idea of use and disuse. And other is that inheritance of acquired characteristics. And that's really, really important, because sometimes people think or dismiss Lamarck's ideas as if he got evolution wrong. But actually, this idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics is proposing that there is going to be inheritance. So the genes, well, he didn't know about genes, but something was passing from the parents to the offspring, and those are modified traits. So it's the idea of evolution. You probably know this from high school. The use of the neck, he proposed that the use of the neck in giraffes, they were trying to reach leaves on the trees, and obviously that exercise led to stretching the neck. Right? So now we know that that's not entirely true. We know, for example, that that's not true, because if you have a bonsai tree and you cut it to maintain it small, the offspring of that tree is not going to be small or like a bonsai type. It's going to be a large tree. And then here we have Cuvier, Georges Cuvier, who was a French, a naturalist, and he is considered the father of paleontology. He studied zoology, and in particular vertebrate fossils. So if you're not familiar with paleontology, on Earth we have a lot of strata or stratum, and there is some sedimentation. For example, here we have rivers carrying sediments into the aquatic habitats, and these layers get accumulated through time. And as I was saying, Earth has 4.5 billion years, right? It's a lot of time. So these processes have been occurring for a long time, and then we can cut these sections, make sections on Earth, and look at the fossil record. It's a very important and valuable tool to understand evolution. But this father of paleontology, Georges Cuvier, proposed the catastrophism. And in this idea, he proposed that one layer, in one layer you could have some species, and then in the other one, in the next one, he realized that these species were no longer present, but others might be present later on. And he thought that it was a divine act, an act of God, that there was something horrible that happened, and God destroyed the species, and then God repopulated Earth with new species, and then cleared it again, and so on. So that's the idea of catastrophism. That is an opposed idea to evolution, in which a species gradually evolve or gradually change. So this Cuvier proposed that there is no change in the species, and God is replacing them, actually. So then let's talk about Darwin. So Darwin, at the age of 23, he traveled the world for 5 years, I think. He was a British, and he traveled in the Beagle, this ship here. And he traveled all around the world. And today we're going to be focusing on his findings, or one of the findings in the Galapagos Islands. This is a group of islands near the equator, or on the equator, near the Ecuador, the country, the actual part of this country. And he realized that in each island there were different birds, and these are the finches. So this is just a close up of the islands, and look at the different sizes of these islands. These islands have different forms and different conditions in these islands. And this is going to be important to understand the source of food that the birds have in each island. I have posted also a video about this. It's a very cool video. I hope that you like it. That's the next activity that you have to complete. And you will get a little bit more of this information. But basically, the summary of this is that in different islands, different birds have different vegetation, different food sources. And because of that, they can have modifications on their beak. And this, for example, this beak, it's adapted to eat from these cactus. So these are fruits. They're actually quite delicious, this fruit. The seed eaters have larger beaks and stronger, so they could be able to crack these seeds that are really hard. And insect eaters, for example, have very narrow, thin, and light beak, which it's optimal to catch and to eat insects. So if you think about this, the beaks are actually tools that they could use. And the idea that Darwin formulated is that these different the environmental pressures were the responsible of making or promoting these changes in the phenotype of these birds. So this is the idea of natural selection, how the environment is filtering some phenotypes. But how does evolution occur? It's primarily occurring through natural selection. And the idea of natural selection was first formulated simultaneously by Charles Darwin, and he published this book in 1859, The Origin of Species. But also they published simultaneously so a couple of articles in explaining the evolution through natural selection. And when I say they, I refer to Alfred Russel Wallace. So this is the full title of The Origin of Species. It's a very cool book. If you have the opportunity to read it, please do it. This is the book. This is it. So Darwin provided and provided evidence for evolution, right? With these examples of finches and with other many examples that we don't have time to cover here. But he documented with a very extreme detail all of these examples in this magnificent book. But then evolution, as you remember, there were other proponents of evolution before Darwin. So he proposed a mechanism as well. So he reviewed the evidence and he provided a mechanism. And the mechanism is through natural selection. So evolution can occur through natural selection. But we're going to see that that's not the only mechanism by which evolution occur. He made this drawing of how species are related. And this is another concept, very important, because what is saying is that there are ancestral species that then evolve, and then through modifications they evolve, and now we have these two different species over here, and then we have this kind of network, but this is phylogenetic relationships, how species are related to each other. And I think this is the eureka moment that Darwin had in understanding how the species evolve from pre-existing species through evolution. And hopefully this reminds you of this exercise that we had in last week when I asked you what's the most closely related allele to one question, and we explain that these two are more closely related and these two are more closely related, and then we can understand these relationships based on these mutations. So the idea is very similar, right? The only difference is that Darwin didn't have a sequence of genes. So this was his eureka moment, I think, or one of many. Okay, Darwin made crucial observations. So first, he noticed that there was variation in the traits in some populations. And also he noticed that those traits were inherited from parents to offsprings. And later he realized that all the species are capable of producing offspring or more offspring than the environment can support. And that is, if you remember, that takes us back to Malthus. This guy studying demography. Yeah, that's the same guy. And then there needs to be a struggle for existence or reproduction. So he also realized that many offspring do not survive due to lack of food. Okay, so those were some crucial observations. And so basically, for natural selection to occur, we need to have variation in the population. That variation needs to be heritable. And then we also need to have differential survival or reproducibility or differential reproduction. That those are the conditions that are needed for natural selection to occur. Okay, and then Darwin made two important inferences. One is that some individuals can have higher probability of surviving and reproducing than others, and therefore they will have more offspring. And if that happens over time, those individuals will lead in the accumulation of these favorable traits in the population over generations. So Darwin postulated all of these ideas, and he wrote this book of The Origin of the Species. He often referred to artificial selection as a way as a compatible way on how natural selection occurs. So let's explain artificial selection. In artificial selection, humans, that's the artificial part, as opposed to natural selection, humans select one trait. This is, for example, this is one example, wild mustard. These species have been selected in many different ways. We as humans, have selected the leaves. Selection of the leaves have led to the kale. I love kale. Oh my God, I eat kale almost every day. We have also selected other type of leaves to form Brussels sprouts. And the tip, right, selection for apical bud give us the cabbage. And the flowers, we have selected to have many, many flowers, very tiny, but a lot of flowers. That's what we know as broccoli. And selection of the stem is actually this vegetable, kohlrabi. All of these look dramatically different, but they come from the same species. This is the same species. We have just selected different features. So maybe thousands of years ago for these species, humans have selected these features, and over generations, we have this diversity. We have selected these features. The idea of natural selection, it's the same. It's, but instead of being selected by humans, it's being selected by nature, right? It depends on the environment. So Darwin proposed a mechanism for natural selection to explain the history of adaptation and how evolution occurs. I have this question for you. First person who proposed the idea of evolution, and that means that the species are not fixed. A, Wallace, B, Darwin, C, Aristotle, D, Lamarck, and E, Cuvier. I think that was very easy. From these options, The first person who proposed the idea of evolution is Lamarck. And so we have said that Darwin and Wallace proposed it later than Lamarck, and Aristotle didn't really think in the evolution, but more as a fixed ladder. And Cuvier was actually thinking about something very opposite to evolution, which was that the species were fixed. Now, what's the result of natural selection? The result is adaptation. And adaptation is a feature, is a trait that provides a particular function for an organism, right? And it's also a feature that increases the fitness. And fitness, we can measure it as the survivability and the ability to reproduce. For example, we can measure how many children you guys can have. That will be your fitness, right? If you have 0, your fitness is 0. So far, most of you have a fitness of 0. But then if you have 1 child, your fitness will increase to 1, and so on. We also can measure fitness as our ability to survive, and also some indirect fitness could be how vigorous we are. So, or you can look at plants, see how much they grow every year, but you can also count how many seeds they have, or how many offspring they have. So that this will be the fitness. But the adaptation might be different. In the case of the plants, adaptations might be related to tolerate the stress, tolerate drought, and that's an adaptation. It could be associated to make photosynthesis, expand the leaves more, or it could be defending themselves from predators, creating some structures that help them to resist more. You know, all of those are traits that we define, and they provide a function. What is important is that these adaptations vary with different environments. So imagine a cactus, and we have a cactus that it has an adaptation to drought, and it has a very thick cuticle. Cuticle is a layer of a lipid that has a function to protect this cactus from the sun or from the drought, because cactus are mainly in deserts, right? But now imagine that we move this cactus to a more tropical area, and the cactus from the desert now lives in this tropical area. Obviously, that adaptation, it's not gonna really help in that condition, right? So the adaptation and the fitness associated to that adaptation, it's gonna depend on the environment. So if the conditions change, the adaptation might no longer be beneficial, or the trait might not be beneficial. Let's review some concepts. Adaptive evolution is a process in which traits that enhance survival or reproduction tend to increase in frequency over time. So when we say adaptive evolution, we're referring to a process. An adaptive trait, as I mentioned before, it's actually a feature, a heritable trait. This part is important. The trait needs to be heritable. Now, I cut my hair recently. Let's see, I just cut my hair. The fact that I cut my hair, it's a trait. I have short hair now, but is that going to happen? It's going to be passed to my offspring? It's not going to pass to my offspring. So some traits are not heritable. So adaptive traits are traits that need to be heritable. And also they are traits that need to improve the survival of the offspring or the reproduction. Right? So that means living longer or have more vigorous photosynthesis if you're a plant, not you, but if they are a plant, and also reproduce more. So those are conditions for an adaptive trait. Now let's cover these morphological adaptations. So these are the traits, these are examples of some of the traits that I have mentioned. In the case of the cactus, we talk about the cuticle, which is a layer, and the outside layer that covers this cactus. They also have other series of adaptations. They have a lot of adaptations to desertic areas. And one of them is these spines. So these spines protect them from herbivory. As you can imagine, in deserts, there are not much food. So these very succulent plants need to be protected because otherwise everybody will be eating them. So they have this protection, but also these spines can reflect some of the sun, and then this is an adaptive trait. Other series of adaptive traits are associated to camouflage. We can see these flower mantis from Malaysia. These mantis looks a lot like orchids, and they live around orchids. And by mimicking these flowers, they can escape predation. Same thing with these leaf mantids in Borneo. The leaf mantid. These are examples of camouflage. Now, can you see what I can see here? This is cool, huh? This is a frog, and it looks almost identical to the background, which is this rock. So by looking like that, you can escape predation. I was hiking once, and I put my hand close to one of these things. It didn't move, but I was very close to it. It was very, very interesting to see how it really matches the background. This is one of the iconic examples of evolution and how different traits change through time. This is the pepper moth, Bistum betullaria. This is the Latin name, Bistum betullaria right here. This moth was very common in pre-industrial form, before the Industrial Revolution. Most of the trees have lichen on the trees. And then this moth used to be whitish. So by being white, they could escape predation because they were on top of these lichens, and no one can really catch them, or it was difficult for predators to find them. In contrast, this other morphotype, the black morphotype, was less common because they were easy targets. So when they were on top of these lichens on these trees. So this morphotype, let's say, have a genotype that is AA and makes them dark. So the dominant is the dark. And then after the Industrial Revolution, a lot of pollution started to get deposited in these streets, so that the lichen was no longer growing on trees. These change in the environment had an effect on the allele frequencies that change the morphotype, the abundance of these phenotypes. Because now the black moth was not that visible in comparison to the white moth, right? So this is one of the examples that changes in the environment can lead to rapid evolution. Just few decades resulted in these changes, in having predominantly white moths to have more black moths. And because this is heritable, this is a heritable feature, it's in the genes, this is considered an adaptive trait, and it's changing the allele frequencies. Remember, alleles are copies or variations of the same gene, the same loci. I have another question for you. Select the answers that contains examples of adaptive traits. So A, B, and C are adaptive traits. The most difficult probably was the examples of the gray whales, because this is behavioral feature. It's a behavioral feature, but it's considered also an adaptive trait. Okay, now you know more about the evolution by natural selection, and this is one of the most important ways to evolve, but it's not the only one. Next class, we're gonna cover other mechanisms and other ways to evolve. I hope that you have enjoyed this class. Thank you.